Am I dead?
No, no. You've been healing so quickly. And no organs were hit, and your bleeding was really mild.
What this is a room is.
This is a room in our house, but it's your home for as long as you need.
Beau is Afraid is a wild movie. Knowing Ari Aster, you know that you're always in for a weird time, but the fact that A24 let him make this film is kind of ridiculous, but also awesome at the same time. If you've seen Hereditary or Midsummer, you're probably familiar with his twisted work. Beau is Afraid is no different, except that by the time you finish this 3-hour rodeo, you'll realize how simple the concept actually is, despite the complexity of lots of scenes. The movie is pretty much one big anxiety attack, with a side dish of parental trauma. Beneath all these extended and buried layers is a mostly straightforward story that really comes down to guilt, shaming, and a very controlling mother. The first hour is pretty much just all your fears being thrown at you at once. It's an absolute blast. It's funny, weird, and even cheesy at times. And while the plot doesn't get serious until the second act, there are still small details that help develop the story early on. The second act loses steam, but prevents a much more vocal message describing the state of Beau's depressing, life situation, and a reminder of this idea of what he wanted his life to really be and how great of a length he would go to make sure he was the best father possible, because that's something he dreamed about, and just someone that wouldn't give up or abandon them no matter what the circumstance. Motherly control becomes a lot more persuasive in this act, even though she doesn't actually have a presence. Something that I like about this film is that it displays controlling parents in such an obvious and huge way. There was no subtlety here. For Aster to drive his point home, it almost felt like he had to make it feel as overdramatic as possible for you to understand the long-term effects of these issues, because, of course, this is an absurd over-dramatization of how it looks, but it's done in such a way so that you can almost feel that same relentless anxiety yourself. The therapist, Roger and Grace, and even his crush as a kid are all hired by his mother to test Beau and his loyalty to her. It's so hard to put a lot of it into words without spending half an hour breaking it down bit by bit, but yeah, it's pretty messed up. The third act is extremely difficult to get descriptive about. I felt like a lot of it was more metaphorical almost, especially the ending. It's a much more direct confrontation of the themes Aster has slowly built up over the last 2.5-ish hours, using dreams and flashbacks to Beau's childhood to assess his complicated feelings in the wake of his mother's death. Her death really was simply another way to ensue guilt on him and trick him into a manipulative state. Mona is still at the helm of his conscience, and that's not even the final nail in the coffin. This movie, when finished, is pretty easy to summarize with a couple of exceptions that may take a bit of in-depth reading before being satisfied or frustrated with what you just watched. I get the sense that while Beau overall is the punchline, the movie at its forefront is a deeply personal letter to the director himself. And from what I can take away from this movie, it's almost like he's confronting these anxieties in a way that makes it laughable, maybe to help him make peace with these nagging neuroses that have controlled him all his life. One can only hope that crafting a movie this self-deprecating was helpful in some way. Hopefully the experience helped him at least confront it. It's a hard movie to like if you're very used to formulaic storylines. This is very different. It's not what you expect at all. This is one of those movies that does something that will no doubt leave you torn in some way. Some people will love this movie, particularly people hungry for something so twisted and hard to process. And some people will like this movie. They'll be aware of the flaws, but willing to appreciate how different and unique this movie is. Then some people will also just straight up hate this movie. They wanted a horror movie, or they wanted something more straightforward and easier to follow. All opinions are interesting. For me personally, I found myself in the second boat. I liked Beau is Afraid and appreciated what it did differently, but it's not hard to notice how unnecessary a lot of it is, and this is clearly one of those films that will only really appeal to a small group of audiences. Nonetheless, it was an incredibly unique experience, one that I hope not to forget.